Dr. Paul Stenner is currently the chair in social psychology at the Open University. Dr. Stenner has contributed to the development of a critical and reflexive approach to social psychology that takes process and relationality as foundational. He works across, between, and beyond disciplines while grounding his work in the problem of experience. Dr. Stenner frequently engages with social theory and philosophy, most recently with process theory and thinking. His recent theoretical work has paid critical attention to the concept of liminality, and he published a book recently on this subject called Liminality and Experience, a transdisciplinary approach to the psychosocial, which was published by Palgrave. Dr. Stenner is not only interested in crossing disciplinary boundaries, he's also quite collaborative in his work and research. We're pleased to have him as our next keynote presentation. After this talk, we're going to have a live question and answer session, so we'd love for you to submit your questions and join us then.
Hello, my name's Paul Stenner. First, I'd like to say thank you to the conference organisers, both for organising such an excellent and interesting conference and for inviting me to speak at it. Now, following the lead of the conference title, the talk I am going to give now makes some observations about what COVID-19 might teach us about how we can think psychologically about global crises. But first, a quick word about these two words, psychology and crisis. And in making these comments, I'm picking up on a point that Morton Nissen made in his keynote. So first, I take the word psychology to refer to experience. And as a social psychologist, I take a special interest in the social conditions which occasion actual experience and conduct. I mention this because it's not obvious to me that many psychologists share this definition of our discipline's subject. And also, although it might seem a little abstract and remote, actually one of the things that I hope will change as a result of the pandemic crisis is the way in which we think about the psychological. So an ill-conceived psychology contributes to what was so wrong about the old normal that was interrupted by the liminal event of the pandemic. We need to combine resources, I think, and thoroughly rethink the psychological as experience. But of course, that's not all that's at stake. Second, the word crisis has a long and rich heritage. So Reinhard Koselleck has amply shown in his history of the concept that it derives from the Greek krino, meaning to separate, decide, quarrel, and so on. And from its ancient origins in Greek medicine and law, it involves what I'd like to call a double separation. That is to say, even in ancient times, there was an ambiguity whereby the word could refer both to a turning point marked by a decisive judgment and to the troubled process giving rise to that judgment. So in the case of medicine, the troubled process is the illness itself, which can be viewed as a physiological crisis which separates us from our health, if you like, a raging fever, for example. And the turning point marked by a decisive judgment is the medical decision about diagnosis and prognosis. Will the patient live or die? In the case of law, the first separation concerning the troubled process is the conflict or quarrel requiring legal settlement, an escalating feud, for example. And the second separation is the legal judgment deciding the fate of those on trial. Is the defendant innocent or guilty? So the concept of crisis entails a combination of these two types of separations. The second, a decisive and authoritative response which cuts into the problems introduced by the first. And in this way, in pointing to a life-deciding tipping point, the concept of crisis involves or incepts an inherent demand for decision. Now, today, crisis talk is mobilised everywhere and is arguably the defining category of our contemporary world situation. So since at least the 1970s, it's been said that we've entered a global systemic crisis. There is, as Koselleck points out, quote, virtually no area of life that has not been examined and interpreted through this concept, with its inherent demand for decisions and choices. In addition to medical and legal crises, for example, we now have identity crises, energy crises, political crises, spiritual crises, environmental crises, crises in the sciences, and so on and so forth. Not just crises from the local to the global then, but crises across the physical to the organic, through the psychic, to the social, to the political, right up to the global. And neither is the global nature of crisis new. So already for Leibniz in the 17th century, the emerging Russian Empire spelled crisis for Europe. But it was first used in the distinctively modern sense of a prognosis of the global political future, according to Koselleck, by Rousseau in 1762 when he wrote, quote, "We are approaching a state of crisis and a century of revolutions." From then on, whether one proposed revolution or evolution, a crisis was a phase of turmoil that must be decisively seized for the sake of the future. Modernity is that constant seizure, and I deliberately intend here the resonance with the seizures of a medical variety. Modernity can seem like a permanent fit of crisis upon crisis. Koselleck ends his history of the concept of crisis with a piece of advice for future scholars to, quote, "weigh the concept carefully before adopting it in their own terminology." Now, heeding this advice, I invite consideration of what the concept of liminality brings to our understanding of crisis. I've observed how the concept of crisis, with its double separation, can lure us towards a demand for rapid and stark decisions. The concept of liminality, by contrast, derives from the Latin limen, meaning threshold. Now, although a threshold certainly makes a certain separation between regions, liminality emphasizes various kinds of transitions across these thresholds. So instead of rushing ahead towards epochal separation, liminality lures us towards consideration of the processes in between and invites us for a moment at least to stay with the trouble, to use a phrase from Donna Haraway. So when Arnold van Gennep coined the term liminal as part of his treatise on rites of passage in the early 19th century, he identified a three-phase pattern to those rites. So between the rites of separation, when we say goodbye to the old world, and the rites of incorporation, when we say hello to the new world, what we find are the liminal rites, in which we can momentarily experience what it is to exist in a deterritorialized condition on the cusp between those two worlds, the one we've just left behind and the one we may be going into. So to link this to my initial point about psychology and experience, the concept of liminality, although theoretical, also invites us to consider the role of experience in situations of intense and unusual experience, such as those at play in a crisis. So liminal experience, if given proper consideration and respect, can help us to move into the unknown future, but with a past that's sensitive to our new present. Okay, why my subtitle, Stuck in the Middle with Coronavirus? So Stuck in the Middle with You is a song written by Jerry Rafferty and Joe Egan in the early 1970s. And for those of you who don't know it, it has a very contagious chorus refrain which goes, "Clowns to the left of me, jokers to the right, here I am, stuck in the middle with you." And the singer announces in the third verse that he's trying to make sense of it all, and then quickly concludes, "But I can see that it makes no sense at all." I'm going to suggest that we particularly need to make sense of those aspects of the coronavirus pandemic that we can see make no sense at all. And to do this, I'll propose that we view the liminal crisis through the theoretical lens of liminal experience. And if we do this, we come to see various ways in which we can become stuck in the middle of a transition, or to use a phrase that a number of colleagues and I coined recently, we're held suspended in liminal hotspots of various kinds. Now, approaching the crisis through the lens of liminality has the advantage of drawing attention to the importance of an in-between phase in which the process of becoming something other acquires significance. It invites us not to deny but to linger on what can happen to us when the familiar ordered forms of process that usually structure our lives undergo unfamiliar transformations. The emphasis on the in-between phase of liminality becomes particularly important, I think, when the old normal that's been disturbed was, to put it bluntly, an environmentally unsustainable, grossly divisive, and demonstrably destructive normality characterised by permanent crisis. If we respond yet again only in the register of crisis, we will only deepen and tighten the liminal hotspot we've made for ourselves. And in this respect, by the way, I hope that my research resonates with those of people like Isabel Stengers, Donna Haraway, Naomi Klein, and many more. Now, drawing on a long tradition of liminality scholarship, the political scientists Agnes Horvath and Arpad Sakolsky, who are influences on my approach, document a dangerous tendency for what they call tricksters to rise to political power by exploiting the confusion of liminal situations. And as is quite well known beyond the United Kingdom, the current Prime Minister of the UK was one of the few principal architects of the Leave campaign that led to Brexit and the lengthy phase of political paralysis that followed until it was swept up into the larger liminal crisis of the COVID-19 pandemic. So right now, the country is still discussing the implications of Boris Johnson's announcement on May the 10th about the next phase of lockdown. His announcement's given rise to widespread confusion. And this is perhaps no surprise, given that his speech appears like an extended double bind. And a double bind, as first discussed by Gregory Bateson, is a self-defeating communicative situation which, if we take the utterances we're presented with seriously, our implications for practice are paralysed and our possibilities for action are paralysed. Now, although the confusion that has so far resulted is by no means funny, a comedian, Matt Lucas, has summed up this aspect of the speech, I think, better than any academic could. So I'll play you a little bit Matt Lucas parodying this speech.
So we are saying, don't go to work, go to work. Don't take public transport, go to work, don't go to work. Stay indoors. If you can work from home, go to work. Don't go to work. Go outside, don't go outside. And then we will or won't do something or other.
So Johnson's discourse is combined with a highly distanced form of governance by media announcement, which involves very little practical engagement on the part of his government with how their announced directives and suggestions can be acted on in actual practice on the ground. And this creates a disconnect or a short circuit between high ideals and on-the-ground practicalities. And this has paralysing implications for both. It also creates conditions for the government to allocate responsibility for what goes wrong to ordinary people and possibly to scientists too, whilst claiming credit to them, whilst giving credit to themselves for any positives that result. Now, I'll now go in to an analysis of Johnson's speech, which tries to specify two related things. First, that his approach denies and avoids the liminal features of our situation that I think are so important. Second, that by denying and through his efforts to avoid it, he is generating further liminality through his paradoxical communication. And I refer to the first as an effort to eliminate liminality. And here by elimination, I mean to expel or to thrust beyond the threshold or limin. But like garden weeds that we must perpetually expel, the liminal cannot in fact be eliminated. So even when it's denied the dignity of its own reality and its own power to transform us, the liminal phase still exists and will not go away. And like Frankenstein's monster, the unacknowledged liminal comes back to haunt us in a more vicious form. Johnson tightens the liminal hotspots by denying the liminal phase and rushing us back into a normality of permanent crisis. Johnson began his speech by saying that following 2 months of lockdown, we now enter a second phase, in which the instruction "stay at home" is replaced by the slogan "stay alert." The aim is now to avoid a second viral spike by keeping the R measure of viral reproduction rate below 1. So using the language of business consultancy firms like McKinsey, Johnson's speech teases out 2 particular threads to weave his narrative: lives and livelihoods. The virus threatens not just our biological lives, but also our economic livelihoods, not just our health, but also our wealth. The first phase of the lockdown, he claims, has succeeded in protecting lives, but this has required a suspension of millions of livelihoods. Those now inactive millions, he said, fear not just for their lives, but also for their livelihoods. The R value will help determine an alert level from 1, meaning problem solved, to 5, meaning overwhelming risk. And as the threat to lives reduces with the alert level, so measures will be relaxed and livelihoods restored. So he wants a win-win situation that addresses both fears, and so offers what he calls a first sketch of a roadmap for reopening society. Now, having set the terms, he goes on to say that those who can't work from home, meaning mostly those who are working class and hence more vulnerable to dying from the virus, should now go to work. But they should try to stay 2 meters apart and avoid public transport where possible. Employers, he promises, will be guided on how to make workplaces COVID secure. And by June, the hope is to begin reopening shops and schools, and by July to reopen the hospitality industry. But we will only progress downwards from level 4 if R is kept down by people staying alert and following the rules, and by the government testing and tracing more people and continuing to protect the NHS. So as our lives are saved through staying alert to guidance by science, so our livelihoods will reopen. But to beat what he calls the vicious threat of this devilish, invisible killer, and to keep our lives and livelihoods, everyone must participate in making this plan work. So this call for unity, collaboration around a construction of the virus as a diabolical, vicious threat is crucial to Johnson's rhetoric, and it mobilises a prized national image of World War II victory. And in this speech, lives and livelihoods, health and wealth, the biological and the economic are seamlessly intertwined as the unquestioned primary values threatened by the coronavirus. As if vital health and the economy were natural bedfellows. The unquestionable aim is to restore these to pre-crisis levels, or better, to strengthen their resilience. As individuals come back to robust health, so the UK will become more economically dynamic and more resilient to threats than ever, he says. So in Johnson's vision, the transitional phase itself is constructed as something entirely threatening and negative. More, it's something above all that we, quote, must and do fear, and also that we must collectively eliminate. So far from dwelling upon the liminal hotspot, it's quite literally demonized. So the cultural liminal phase between worlds that should interest us, I think, so much, is made to disappear through a focus upon the apparently good world of the past and the one that's been so rudely interrupted on the one hand, and the even better world of the future that will soon take shape. It's as if we were crossing a gaping chasm between two solid land masses, and that above all we must not look down. This is what I mean by the elimination of the liminal. But while denying the liminal, Johnson's combination of double-bind communication and governance by distanced announcement has meant, in fact, that ambiguities, paradoxes, and anxieties have multiplied like the heads of the Hydra. Now, nowhere, I think, is the human tragedy that results from this approach more visible than in the case of the care homes for the elderly. Now, although the data on this are contested, it's clear that a considerable proportion of COVID-19 deaths in the UK have been concentrated in care homes. And this is no accident, I would suggest. It was known since at least January that the elderly with pre-existing conditions are by far the most likely to die from COVID-19. And yet, not only were care homes not adequately protected, they were actively exposed to the virus in two ways. First, through receiving people who were sent away from hospitals to protect the NHS, though without testing. And second, through exposure to care workers who often work in several different care homes. So given the scandalous lack of testing or tracking in the UK and the lack of protective equipment or PPE, this has turned too many care homes into virus factories and too many carers into super spreaders. But of course, from Johnson's perspective on high, he's announced all the correct ideals. He's called for testing, he's called for PPE, he's called for the protection of care homes lately. But nevertheless, he and his government have for the most part simply left it to others to execute these ideals in practice with very little planning and very little resourcing. So I suggest that there's also another reason why care homes have become liminal hotspots of intensified COVID-19 risk. The elderly and the infirm are liminal for various reasons, but one reason is that they fall outside of the easy biopolitical double logic of health and wealth, lives and livelihoods that's at the core of Johnson's vision. Those whose lives fall on the wrong side of the threshold of economic productivity, because they're not economically productive, disappear from view, and so risk disappearing in reality. And in a slightly different way, the same goes for the care workers, who, as we know, are poorly paid and precariously employed. These, it seems to me, are the stakes at play in Johnson's elimination of the liminal. He wants to rush us into a future with our eyes closed and with the vulnerable in the front line. Now, David Kaposhi and I have argued in another context that it's as if we were invited to ignore the liminal nature of the lockdown by thinking of it as a mere pressing of the pause button on a piece of recorded music, for example, that we're listening to. This metaphor has proliferated. Now, when the appropriate alert level is signalled, we will press play, and the same music will continue, maybe even a little louder. But if we view the crisis and the lockdown not just as a pause, but as a liminal event or series of multi-layered liminal events, then we can begin to understand how the song after the pause can be a different song. And indeed, how the song even before the pause can turn out to be different to that which we had taken it to be. We may even find that it's not recorded after all, and that we can compose a song and sing it ourselves. Now, two entirely different conceptions of time are at play in the difference between a mere pause and a liminal event. These conceptions can both be accommodated, I think, by a social psychology adequately oriented to experience. One conception views time instrumentally and as if from the outside, as a mere chronology. From this perspective, it's impossible for the song before the pause to be different from the song after the pause, a mere bit of trickery. The other conception views time from the perspective not just of the one going through it, but of the one constituted by it, the one whose present is informed by the fact that she is capable of imagining a future and of remembering a past. So human psychology certainly entails the experience of a present that is constituted through its integration with a remembered past and an imagined future. So the world that we consciously experience is that symbolically mediated composite construction. The first conception of time as an externality is itself, of course, also an experience, but it's an experience that can take for granted this complex symbolic mediation. The second conception emerges through experiences in which the first can no longer be taken for granted because it has been disrupted. Then we have an experience not just thanks to a taken for granted time, but with time and of time. So time as chronology is disrupted and transforms into time as process. So taking this second conception or experience of time as process, we need to understand how a liminal event can introduce a phase of radical uncertainty that is able to disrupt and reorder expectations of the future and to reconfigure memories of the past and therefore transform the very seat of reality, the present. So to understand how the song itself can change in this way, we can find some resources in the social psychology of George Herbert Mead. Now, within social psychology, it was Mead who first systematically theorised the relations between self, society, and time. And Mead is best known for his account of the human self as an emergent effect of the capacity to take the perspective of the other towards ourself. This makes selfhood and society tightly interconnected, a premise that for me is axiomatic to any serious social psychology, or indeed any psychology. Although Mead didn't use the word liminality or the liminal, the concepts of the present and of sociality and of the emergent event that he developed in his book, The Philosophy of the Present, are still, I think, fresh and relevant and worth revisiting briefly. So Mead develops a quite specific definition of sociality, which requires these other concepts of the present and the emergent event. The emergent, for example, the advent of the COVID-19 pandemic, is a novel becoming that was not there in advance and that adds something new to what subsequently passes. It's a newcomer whose advent interrupts and transforms the sense of the present, where the present is for Mead the seat of reality and the vantage point from which the past and the future acquire their salience. So the sociality of the present is something quite precise. It is for Mead the stage betwixt and between the old system and the new. It's the phase of adjustment and transition that must necessarily occur when a present, which he calls the world of a given system, is disrupted. But new coherence has yet to be established. Now, such adjustment includes the emergence of a new present, which also means a certain revision of the prevised past and the prevised future that had constituted what is in the process of becoming the old or past present. Now, being in the middle of a pandemic, we are in a now that makes it quite easy, I think, to appreciate what Mead means by a present and a future that now feel as though they belong to the past, and hence can be called the past future and the past present. And we also know what it means to live without a clear sense of a future that has replaced the past future. We look forward, in other words, to a future future. This is not just playing with words on Mead's part. It's taking seriously the fact that Shakespeare expressed so clearly through the vehicle of Hamlet, during a liminal situation, time is, quote, thrown out of joint. Now, Mead, as far as I know, is the first social psychologist to insist upon the reality of this phase of passage, the reality of this transition between worlds. Now, although I won't go into detail here, in drawing attention to this transitional phase betwixt and between worlds, Mead is articulating at an ontological level a concept that's practically identical to the more specifically anthropological concept of the liminal that Arnold van Gennep had articulated in 1909 in his book Rites of Passage. Van Gennep used the word liminal to refer, as I've mentioned, to transitional rituals during which those involved undergo a passage from one social status or social world to another. Gennep and Mead shared the insight common to all serious thinkers of process, that since human selves are shaped and formed within and through social practices, so any notable changes in social practice, in social status or in position and so on, demands a correlative change in self-construct, a change that must in turn be recognised by others. This explains why significant psychosocial changes like death, remarriage, initiation, and so on, tend to be carefully managed by way of rites of passage, with their separation, transition, and incorporation phases. And the point is that this threefold pattern of preliminal, liminal, and postliminal rituals facilitates a transformation of expectations and potentializes their alignment into new forms of subjectivity. But in discussing liminality, we need to be careful about specifying the level and the scale at which we are applying the concept. Van Gennep was writing quite specifically about rituals within small-scale human societies. And in this context, liminal experiences are occasioned ritualistically in quite deliberate ways. The experiences are, if you like, self-generated. They're culturally scaffolded. And for this reason, I call them devised liminal experiences. It was Victor Turner who first extended liminality theory to what he called modern societies and to what he called unstaged social dramas, like, for example, the pandemic, in which it's not that we do these things to ourselves, it's more like they happen to us. Now, although I don't have time to discuss Turner's work in detail here, it's interesting to observe that he used the very same unusual phrase that Mead uses, the betwixt and between worlds phrase, to describe liminality. So Turner's coining of the term liminality is part of a broadening of Van Gennep's focus on the liminal. But Mead's work opens the even broader prospect of applying the concept as part of an ontology which is relevant to human society, but which goes beyond human life and includes the natural world, so long as that nature can be construed as something basically capable, at however minimal a level, of undergoing experience. Now, it's this ontological concept that I aim to develop in my 2017 book, Liminality and Experience. And put generally, the concept of liminality implies limits, or if you like, forms of order, where liminality is the exceeding or bursting of these limits. So liminality is experienced when the patterns or forms of process that usually sustain, enable, and compose our lives are for some reason disrupted, interrupted, transformed, or suspended. But what we really need to understand is how these disruptions can operate simultaneously at multiple levels and scales. I'll briefly take you through an idea of this now. So at the very core of the pandemic is the event of the emergence of a new type of coronavirus, something that many scientists do not even consider to be alive. It's a very liminal entity in this respect. So this new arrival was named Severe Acute Respiratory Syndrome Coronavirus 2, or SARS-CoV-2 for short. But equally new was COVID-19, not the virus, but the disease it causes on encountering living bodies and converting them into virus factories. The two are conceptually distinct, and yet at the level of event, they are inseparable. It's the thresholds between them that are crucial. So the advent of COVID-19, in other words, is on one level about the liminal disruption caused by a novel virus to the organic forms of process that compose the human body conceived as a biological system. So if we now associate the liminal entity of SARS-CoV-2 with an epidemic, then we should first remember an older meaning of the Greek word epidemia, which was closer to the word epiphany. So as Karenyi observes in his book on the Cretan origins of the cult of Dionysos, the word epidemia was used to announce the new arrival in the land of the new god. But in acknowledging the newcomer, we cannot stop at this interface or threshold between chemical and biological levels, obviously. We introduce a quite different but obviously related level when we add to this the conscious experience of illness that the disease event makes possible for those who go through it, those who get it. So this is a level of disruption that includes the humanly psychological, since it concerns the way in which these chemical and organic transformations going on in our body are experienced by an ill person. But the illness is not just the disruptive psychological experience of our troubled physiology, since the disruption in turn interrupts the patterns of our social activities, our daily lives. We stay at home, for example, or we go to hospital. This interrupted sociality must therefore also be acknowledged as a core factor in any experience of illness. And then, at a different level still, knowledge of all that I've just spoken of provokes in turn disruptive responses within the wider social systems that together we call human society, right up to the global level. For example, when the UK media reported that the Italian lockdown on March the 9th, what should politicians do? The societal transformations we've witnessed globally are evidently downstream with respect to the chemical, biological and psychological events that I've just described, but they're still related to them and they feed back towards them. So lockdown, for example, is a coordinated societal response to the anticipated impact of mass illnesses upon the continued operations of social systems. Now, understood in this way, this is a way of thinking that I've developed with Niels Åkerström Andersen in a couple of recent papers. Understood in this way, lockdown can be construed as equivalent to an autoimmune response, but on the societal level. So, as is well known, the strategy of minimizing the likelihood of infection by maximizing social distance between the infectable bodies is designed to protect the continued functioning of the social system by preventing, for example, health systems from being overwhelmed. So this response requires schools to close, employees in all but essential jobs to stay at home, travel to be minimised, and so on. So to protect its continued operations, society either suspends those operations or finds safer new ways of carrying them on, as when, for example, conferences like this one go online, or university programs do the same. Or activities can be modified, as when perfume companies, for example, start producing hand gel instead. But the transformations involved in this massive societal response impacts all of society's subsystems, not least politics, the economy, law, medicine, and education. Governments, for example, are forced into rapid and massive actions. Basic legal rights are suspended, and so on. Systems that were once clearly differentiated in terms of their functions start to blur and to liminalize. So sports stadia and schools become makeshift hospitals. Unqualified medical students are called into premature professional life. The distinction between governing party and opposition fades out of relevance and back into relevance, and so on. So returning to the psychological level, what happens to us psychologically in this zone of societal liminality where the future we had expected suddenly disappears? To begin with, the psychological and the social simply cannot be separated, since on this level at least, a liminal experience is the experience of a transformed social process. The liminal experiences that many people across the globe have been going through are inseparable from these interruptions to business as usual. For example, schools close and the exams, which students had been preparing for, are abruptly cancelled. Jobs are furloughed or lost, or for the privileged, moved online. And everyone is surely thinking, will I have a job tomorrow? Not to mention those who lose their loved ones or who get sick themselves. In each case, what we expected of our future just moments before suddenly becomes what Mead would call a past future. And yet the new present, the present present, is characterised by the fact that there is no new future yet to replace it, no present future. Essentially, what was our immediate future is replaced, again if we are lucky, with a new future that's rather hard for anybody to imagine and hence to expect. Now, paradox becomes an endemic feature of a liminal present like this, precisely because one finds oneself between worlds. So this is because what we might call the orthodox logic of either or, which happens in a world context, gives way to a logic that includes both and neither nor. So to give a trivial example, when the child at home receives occasional input from their old teacher, and occasional at-home tuition from a parent, that is, the home suddenly becomes both a home and a school. But that can equally mean that it's neither a home nor a school. And meanwhile, the school building is transformed from its prior educational function and serves as a base for the children of frontline key workers, giving in turn a sort of quasi-medical role to the key worker teachers. Again, this blurring, liminalizing of the functions. Now, we've seen thousands of such examples in the past few months, and in each case, to return to Mead's terminology, the newcomer of an emergent event interrupts and transforms the sense of the present, where the present is the vantage point from which the past and the future acquire salience. The paradoxes that result are not merely a cognitive matter of experienced uncertainty, but also a practical matter, both of being caught between competing and incompatible directives for action, and also simply not knowing what to do. Now, if we are to de-paradoxify this situation, to use an ugly word, it's necessary to acknowledge the newcomers of the emergent event and to live through a curious phase which belongs neither to the past as we knew it, nor to the future as we previously experienced it. Okay, to conclude, I've sketched the outline of a perspective on the pandemic whose keynote is liminality. Occasions during which the familiar train of our experience undergoes unfamiliar transformations are liminal occasions. I've suggested that unlike the concept of crisis, a framing in terms of liminality draws attention to processes of becoming other, and invites us to stay with the trouble at play in these becomings. So the past, present, doesn't seamlessly become something new. Before that, a difficult and paradox-ridden phase must be negotiated and navigated, a liminal hotspot. My aim has been to contribute towards a renewed experiential vision of the psychological as socially embedded and also organically embodied. Now, this may seem idealistic, and indeed idealism can be a danger. So in a bid to escape the paradoxes of liminal occasions, there's a tendency towards polarization. And one such polarization is that between what might crudely be called the dreamers with their ideals and the people of action with their matters of fact. So we've all experienced the call for immediate action over the last few months. We must act now, we are told, the quicker, the better, because there is no time. And this is certainly true because during a crisis, events happen thick and fast, and delay can cause the loss of life. But at the same time, so too are the dreamers awakened and emboldened, precisely because the crisis calls the future into question. So too it opens an opportunity for new futures that might not otherwise have been seriously entertained or got a look in. So curiously, now is the time both for action and for dreaming a different future, for example, as the smog over the world's cities becomes re-established. The problem is that liminal hotspots encourage a stark polarization between dream and action, and this very polarization can trap us. I gave earlier the example of Boris Johnson's peculiar brand of idealism. The dreamer and the person of action must not exclude one another, or else the one will get stuck in their dreams and the other in mechanical repetition. So I began by questioning the way in which the concept of crisis puts undue emphasis upon separation. It confronts trouble with a clear-cut decision, a polarisation, if you like, or even a purification. It doesn't stay with the trouble. It doesn't linger on and learn from what is actually happening, but it quickly imposes a what must happen. And yet separation is not the only response to trouble, to liminal situations. In a rite of passage, for example, separation is just one phase. And in the absence of a liminal phase, it's unlikely that a satisfactory incorporation phase can happen. So liminal experience is about going through and paying attention to what arises and what that makes of us. It's about inhabiting what is actually happening, learning to live with and to learn from what is new as it emerges, moment by moment. But also to connect it to what we were, to not leave behind the past that we were. So coming to terms with the newcomer is not about eliminating it, but about forging a symbiosis with it. If we allow our leaders to force us too quickly into a new normal, I fear that we'll end up singing the same old song of crisis and exploitation. So Isabel Stengers, I think, is right, that if we're going to resist what she calls the coming barbarism, this means struggling for another world, and it means struggling for it from this position betwixt and between worlds. So we who are held in suspense between worlds are a little like Hamlet, who both must act and cannot act. And perhaps we need to somehow come back to our senses, to come back to ourselves, and to dare I say it, come back to our nature. But this requires itself grappling with the paradox that our nature is nothing fixed. Our nature, in a sense, is to flow, and that ourselves are nothing interior, but passages linking us to others. So it is to grasp and to live these paradoxes in a meaningful way that I think we need a better understanding of the psychological. I hope that that presentation was of interest and of use to you. Thank you very much.
And they don't know if you're dead or alive. They kept you secret when you hit the land, in a market in the heart of Wuhan. Clowns to the left of me, jokers to the right. Here I am, stuck in the middle with you. From Singapore to South Korea and Thailand, out came the face masks and the washing of hands. But when you decimated Lombardy, it was clear that you were coming for me. Clowns to the left of me, jokers to the right. Here I am, stuck in the middle with you. Well, you started off as nothing, but now you got the world on its knees. They wanna hit you with a vaccine, but until we got the facts, we just say, please. Johnson and Gove, advised by Cummings and his clowns making free with the theory of herd immunity. Clowns to the left of me, jokers to the right. Here I am, stuck in the middle with you. We had to wait until the middle of March before a lockdown would finally start. We still lack tests and basic PPE, to set us all free. It's the economy, stupid. Clowns to the left of me, South Cove